I want to present here the first of the two models that we're going to look at, and it's called the OSI model. The OSI model stands, or OSI stands for Open Systems Interconnect. It was developed by the International Standards Organization, or ISO. Now, in its original language, by the way, it would be iOS because word order in different languages is a little bit different. So the OSI is written by the ISO, which is the iOS, and oh boy, it can get confusing. But the purpose of this standard was to provide a standard way in which we build things and program things so that vendors' software from different vendors will work with that software and hardware from other vendors. So that's the whole point of this thing, is to segment it, or segment communication in such a way that that we don't have to worry about whether or not this device can communicate in the same way as another device. Let's show a little bit more how that works. Those steps in the model are actually called layers, and as data moves from the application in one computer here, as you can see in layer 7 on sending device, we have application layer. Data is being generated by some application, and that application then is passing that data on to the application layer protocol for whatever type of data that it is. That then moves down to the presentation layer. The presentation layer, we'll talk about what these do more specifically in a little while, then passes that data down to the session layer, which passes it down to the transport layer, the network layer, the data link layer, the physical layer. Now at this point, the physical layer, this is where wires and radio signals and so forth exist. That data moves over to the receiving device and then travels back up through these layers until it finally gets back to the application layer, which is, of course, the application protocol, which talks then directly to the application that can receive that data and understand it. So this is the basics of how it works. Now we're going to talk about what each of these layers does in a lot more detail in another video, but that is the essence of the OSI model. Let's take a little bit more detail at this point, and we're still not as detailed as we're going to be. But here's a just quick and dirty look at what each of these layers does. The application layer is that software that allows access to network resources. These, we'll talk about what some of those protocols are as we go on in another video. The presentation layer then takes that data from the application that generated it, and it changes the format as needed. It can do compression and encryption. It can change from things like Unicode to ASCII and things like that. The session layer then receives that changed data that the presentation layer changed. So the session layer receives it and decides, how am I going to communicate? So it establishes and terminates communication sessions so that it can transfer data. Then the transport layer gets the data. It is responsible for putting on some information. We'll talk again what I mean by that, but adding some information to that data so that the receiving device knows what to do with it when it receives it. The network layer then does the internet addressing. So in other words, those IP addresses that you're used to seeing, 207.15.14.5, that would be at the network layer that addressing is done. Now, within a network, we use a different type of address, typically a MAC address, although there are other ones. So within network addressing is taken care of then by the data link layer. This moves the data to the router so that the network layer address can take over at the router. And then finally, the physical layer is the mechanical electrical transmission itself. So that's the layers in a little bit of detail. And later on then we'll go into a lot more detail about these layers and exactly what they do.